Okay, so we're now recording. I'll officially welcome and thank everybody for joining in our webinar today, which is focusing on rebooting reuse. So ACTS is hosting this webinar as a part of Plastic Free July. And we really think it's an important conversation that we need to be having at the moment in a sort of a post-COVID, or I don't think you can really say post-COVID, but in sort of the new world era that comes following the coronavirus outbreak and pandemic that we've been having, and the impact that that's had on reusables and single-use plastic uptake. So I'm not going to talk too much about that now. There's lots of opportunity for us to have discussion and questions at the end of the webinar session today. I'm very delighted to be able to introduce our three amazing panelists today that will be giving a little bit of a presentation and an overview on a few factors contributing to reusables and how we sort of reboot them in the current climate at the moment. And then we'll invite you to submit any questions that you have after all of our panelists have spoken. So if you would like to ask a question through any point, there is an official Q&A component that you can use in Zoom webinar. So please do type your questions through and I will read them on behalf of you for our panel to address. I'll also keep an eye on the chat function as well. So there is chat and Q&A as two separate things. I will note though that the chat one can get a little bit hard to track over time. So if you type a question in there, it may be missed. So please do put any sort of formal questions through the Q&A component there. You may have capacity to unmute your microphone at the end of the session if you've got a really complex question that you'd like to ask, but we'll see also how we're going on time, because it might be easier just for me to read the questions out on your behalf at the end. I didn't even introduce myself, apologies. My name is Rhiannon Boyd, so I'm the General Manager for ACTS and work with a lot of our members to deliver these sorts of webinars and resources around sustainability for campus organizations. So I'm going to come in with my dog disclaimer as well, because he's just started snoring really loudly behind me. He was being quiet a few minutes ago, so apologies if that's coming through on the microphone. The joys of working from home. Okay, I'm going to stop talking now, so we've got three presenters, as I said, talking to us today. We've got Kim Borg from Behaviour Works, we've got Fabia Pryor from Keep Cup, and we've got Amanda Cunningham from Victoria University of Wellington. So I'll be introducing them each as we go through their presentations. But to get us started today, we've got Kim Borg, who's a research fellow for Behaviour Works Australia, which sits within the Monash Sustainable Development Institute. Kim's got over 10 years of experience in social and behavioural research and is currently in the final year of her PhD, exploring the role of media in shaping social norms surrounding single-use plastic avoidance. So we'll pass over to Kim now to get us started on the webinar, and I'm really interested to hear what you've got to share with us today. Thanks, Kim.
Thank you. Can everyone see my screen and hear me okay? Yep, I'm getting nods from the three heads that I can see. That's good enough. So thank you for inviting me here today. As I mentioned, I am a research fellow at Behaviour Works Australia, which is an applied behavioural research institute that's based at the Monash Sustainable Development Institute. But I'm also a PhD student, and I've been looking exclusively at for the last 2.5 years at single-use plastic in the context of behavioural science, because that's my background. I'm doing this in partnership with the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning in Victoria, and I'm also lucky enough to have some extra support from Sustainability Victoria. So one of the main objectives of my PhD is partly to contribute to academic knowledge, because that's the idea of a PhD, but also to gain some valuable practical insights for practitioners and policymakers. And specifically what I'm looking at is, my working title at the moment is Exploring the Role of Media in Turning the Social Tide on Plastic Pollution. So why plastic pollution? I'm sure many of you know some of these statistics already, but just to give you a bit of context of where I came into this process. So each year, around 275 million tonnes of plastic waste is generated. Of that, around 8 million tonnes is estimated to enter the marine environment. And when plastic enters the environment, it poses a significant threat to a whole manner of marine life. Animals become entangled or ingest plastic debris, mistaking it for food, which can lead to injury and even death. Microplastics are eaten by small animals, which are then eaten by larger animals, which means plastic is getting into the food chain, including into humans' diets. And this is particularly problematic because many plastics contain endocrine disrupting chemicals like BPA, which interfere with hormone levels and even fertility rates. Not to mention those microplastics, which are tiny pieces of plastic less than 5 millimeters in size. When they're in the marine environment, they act like tiny toxic sponges, soaking up all manner of nasty chemicals. In fact, plastic has been identified as a cross-cutting crisis that's inextricably linked with biodiversity loss, climate change, and human health. Now, what I have on my screen at the moment are some of the most common items that are found during litter cleanups in Australia. And what you may notice, as I did, is that these items are almost exclusively single-use plastics. That means they're used for a relatively short period of time and then discarded as waste. Now, some of them can be recycled, but they're not always recycled. And some of them can't be recycled at all, which is even more problematic. But the other thing I noticed is that most of these items are avoidable if people change their behaviour by refusing an unnecessary item like a plastic straw and just drinking straight from a glass instead, or by switching to reusable alternatives for something like a plastic bag, where we have great alternatives like green bags or cotton bags, or switching to reusable coffee cups, plastic containers, cutlery, to name a few. But then, of course, there's the question, well, how do we change behaviour at scale? Now, social norms are one factor that we know influences human behaviour. For those unfamiliar, these are essentially the unwritten rules that guide and constrain our actions based on two things. Number one is what we believe most other people are doing. That's called a descriptive norm. It's literally what we see around us. But there's also an element about what other people approve and disapprove of, which is known as an injunctive norm. So if we believe most people are doing a behavior and we think that we will get sort of social kudos or we will not be reprimanded for doing it, then we're more likely to follow that behavior. Now, in behavioral science, we know that social norms influence a whole range of behaviors, including a lot of environmental behaviors, and particularly when that behavior is ambiguous or new. So, for example, if a new policy is introduced, like maybe a plastic bag ban, if the behavior occurs in public, so shopping at a supermarket, and when the behavior and consequences are well known, so when media coverage is high. There's some research that social norms can influence plastic bag avoidance. We know a little bit about that. But what about other plastic items? What about other avoidance behaviors? We also know much less about the factors that influence our perceptions about social norms. Because as much as it is other people's behavior and opinions that influence our own, we don't always know what's happening. So we rely on our perceptions. And for this part of my research, I wanted to know, number one, what were people doing and thinking at that point in time when it came to plastic avoidance? What was the benchmark? What was the baseline? I also wanted to know how social norm perceptions related to plastic avoidance. So what is the relationship between those behaviors? And were these perceptions being influenced in any way by media? To address these questions, I did what a good social researcher does, and that's conducted a social survey. I called it my Plastics in Society survey, where I wanted to understand these key constructs in my framework, which were media exposure, where I was focusing on information-based mass media. So how much have people been exposed to news or documentary content, particularly about plastic pollution, but also social media, because there's still a big debate, given how relatively new social media is, about whether it's having a good or bad impact on society. I also measured the key constructs in my theory. So that's the theory of normative social behaviour. Essentially, it proposes that our beliefs about descriptive norms, so what we think everyone else is doing, influences our behavioural intention, but that relationship is moderated by a bunch of other variables. So things like our injunctive norm perceptions, whether we think others will approve or disapprove of the behaviour, but also our beliefs about the benefits of engaging in the behavior. So if I avoid plastic, will I feel good? Will I get any benefit? Also, will the environment benefit? Or is it a pointless activity? And then there are elements of identity. So because I was doing the survey with Victorians, asking about other Victorians' behaviour, I also wanted to know how much people identified as a Victorian, because that could strengthen that relationship. And when I was measuring behaviour, while the theory focuses exclusively on behavioural intentions, I'm very familiar with something called the intention action gap. And that's this idea that I might have every intention to avoid plastic all of the time, but there are other things that get in my way. So I extended the theory to also look at reported past behaviours, which I'll add a big asterisk. It's not a perfect measure. Observable behaviour is better, but I worked with what I had. Now, in consultation with DELP, we picked 4 single-use plastic items to focus on. Single-use plastic bags when shopping, single-use plastic straws when at a cafe, restaurant or bar, disposable coffee cups when buying a hot drink, and plastic takeaway containers when buying takeaway food. You may also notice these were some of the most common items found in litter cleanups. So with my representative survey with 1,001 Victorians, I found a lot. What I have in this chart is showing that what percentage of time people reported avoiding, being 100, or using each of the single-use items. So a 100 would mean I always avoid single-use plastic bags when I go shopping. Or a 0 would mean I always use single-use plastic bags. And what you can see here is that there is that intention action gap where people intended to avoid more often than they reported avoiding. But what's more interesting is the gap between their reported behavior at a collective level and how much they believed other people were avoiding. So there was this consistent gap where people believed that they were much better than others when it came to plastic avoidance. Next, I asked respondents, when they are avoiding, what is the specific behavior that they're doing? And you can see it varies depending on which item we're talking about and which behavior we're looking at. So when it came to avoiding plastic bags, many people were already in the habit of bringing a reusable. Almost 90% of people, when they avoid, bring a reusable bag. And I do want to point out, I did this survey before the statewide plastic bag ban came out in Victoria, but after the supermarkets banned plastic bags at a national level. Now for straws, people were less inclined to opt for a reusable alternative. Only about 10%, less than 10% of people did. In fact, the most common response was, well, I just don't use one. It's exactly as I thought going into this research, where people just kind of pick up a glass and drink straight from it. So the avoidance behavior that we're encouraging there is a little bit different. And when it came to our convenience takeaway items, so cups and containers, they were a bit more spread. People were definitely trying and starting to make an effort, but it wasn't necessarily just about reusable alternatives. In some cases, people were changing their underlying behavior. So they were dining in instead of taking out, or buying a sandwich which is wrapped up in paper instead of a salad which comes in a hard plastic container. Next, I did my boring theoretical testing to see whether the moderators really did moderate that relationship. The short answer is yes, most of them did. Group identity was actually not a moderator, which was a little bit surprising. But what was really interesting is when I put all of the variables into the model together. So I could control for the effects of everything at the same time. Descriptive norms were still the strongest predictor of both behavioural intention and reported behaviour. Now, self-efficacy was another important predictor. This is essentially how confident people were that they could avoid each of the items in question every time they were engaging in that behaviour. What's interesting is that self-benefit beliefs, so these are beliefs about I will feel good if I avoid, they were a really important predictor for behavioural intentions. but they were actually not a significant predictor at all for past behavior, which shows, again, some of the differences between that intention versus action. Now, ultimately, what I learned from this part of the analysis is because people think that they avoid more often than most others, and because people's beliefs about others are so important in predicting their behavior, essentially there's a really simple method for changing behavior and encouraging avoidance. And that's by sharing the results of this survey, sharing the news that most people are actually avoiding already. Of course, it also raises the question, where are people getting their information from now regarding what's normal? And as I mentioned before, could media be playing a role? To do this, I did a whole bunch of complex structural equation models, essentially testing, did my 3 media exposure constructs predict my 4 outcome variables? So that was descriptive norms, injunctive norms, and then the self and environmental benefits of avoidance. And the answer is yes, but. So there was some relationship, but it was a bit mixed. So with social media exposure, it was a positive predictor of perceived benefits of avoidance, but a negative predictor of descriptive norms. So those who were exposed to more social media content about plastic believed that avoidance was definitely beneficial, but not many other people were avoiding, and in fact, no one would really care if they were to avoid. Now, news exposure was not a significant predictor of beliefs or perceptions, whereas documentary exposure was a positive predictor of outcome expectation of the perceived benefits and descriptive norm perceptions. So there was something happening here around social media and documentaries. So what are my lessons? What are my key takeouts? Now, again, all of this was done before COVID. So number one, I can say that before COVID, plastic avoidance was becoming normal in Victoria. In fact, it was probably a more normal behaviour than most of us realised. And some of those specific behaviours included reusable bags. They had become very popular. Refusing straws. And even though bringing reusable cups and containers was a less common behaviour, people were starting to make an effort to avoid plastic in other aspects of their life. And even better, what I've learned from this is that avoidance can be normal again. And we can make that happen simply by closing the perception gap, by sharing the results of this survey, that most people were already avoiding and that it is possible to avoid again. Now, media could be an avenue for conveying this messaging. We know that social media and documentaries are already influencing perceptions, but we need to be very careful with how we create those messages so we don't inadvertently promote the undesirable behavior as common, which seems to be happening in social media at the moment. So in addition to promoting the desired behavior, which is avoidance, as common, we also want to present it as easy, beneficial, cheap, and approved by others. Because at the end of the day, we all get a say in what the new normal looks like. Thank you.
Got to remember to unmute myself. I'm terrible at doing that. Thank you so much. Some really interesting research that you're working on there. I'm sure we could do a whole webinar session just on talking about the role of social norms and the influence it has in this area. But I appreciate you giving a sort of very condensed overview of your work. And yeah, I'm sure we'll have some questions at the end of the session for you. But now we're going to move on to Fabia, who's going to be presenting next. Fabia comes from Keep Cup, and I don't really need to introduce Keep Cup. They have become a synonymous, not just as a brand, but as an amazing company that's doing so much to promote reuse and to divert waste from landfill. So Fabia heads up the Global Partnerships, Responsible Business and Advocacy at Keep Cup, and she came to them after a successful career as an international sustainability educator and consultant who believes in revolutionising the industry to shape a fair and biodiverse future. So for more than a decade, she's worked with brands and creatives around the world to boost sustainability in supply chains and to champion corporate sustainability. So without further ado, I will pass over to Fabia to begin her presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rhiannon. Now let's see how this screen sharing goes. Okay, can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for having me. And to begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on Wurundjeri land, country that was never ceded. I acknowledge traditional owners and pay my respects to Aboriginal elders, past, present, and emerging, and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters, and community. So today I'm going to briefly discuss where we were at pre-COVID, talk about where we're at now, specifically through the lens of coffee cups and reuse, and then look a bit towards the future. Where are we headed? So let's start with the problem. Every minute around the world, over 1 million single-use cups are used and discarded. In Australia, approximately 1 billion disposable coffee cups are thrown into landfill each year. As Kim said, we know that single-use plastic is clogging our oceans, our river systems, and our landfills. And 40% of all plastic around the world is used just once before being discarded. Now, only 9% of all plastic ever made has been recycled. So this isn't something that we're going to recycle our way out of, nor is it simply a litter problem. This is something that we need to address from a holistic perspective. And we have seen a global shift from single use to reuse, driven by individuals, by businesses, and by governments. Now, the movement has begun. I think we've seen a couple of different movements when it comes to legislating against single use. I think we saw everyone worried about bags initially, and to begin, we saw plastic bags being legislated, and this is around the world. The second wave saw straws being legislated against. There was that awful image of marine biologists extracting a straw from a turtle's nose, and it really catalyzed everyone to think, oh my God, straws are terrible. And so that moved, whether it be cities, states, countries, to deal with straws. Then legislators started getting sick of dealing with one individual item after another and thought, hang on, we've really got to deal with this more holistically. We've got to develop legislation that deals with a gamut of unnecessary and problematic single-use plastics. And it's that third wave that encompasses cups, straws, balloons, and more. Approximately 112 countries, states, and cities around the world have announced legislation designed to tackle single-use plastics. This is from outright bans to levies. And many of these, as I said, started with bags, but have become much more complex. The EU is probably one of the global standards when it comes to legislation on single-use plastics. So they have passed laws that mean by mid-next year, every EU member state must have passed its own national law banning single-use plastics. And in that ban, the things that are encompassed include cotton bud sticks, cutlery, plates, straws, stirrers, and balloon sticks. It also includes key materials like oxo-degradable plastic and expanded polystyrene. Now, cups and containers are also included in that legislation, but they are under a slightly different lens. They don't have to be banned by EU member states, but EU member states must act on them. So it can be through a ban or partial ban, or it can be by promoting reuse. And as opposed to legislation, there are other countries or other municipalities that are looking at a charge. And this plays into what Kim was talking about. When we see the difference between a charge and a reuse discount, we know that there's a lot of behavioural evidence that shows people are way more adverse to receiving a charge than they are a discount. Hence, cities like Berkeley and California have legislation that says disposable coffee cups must be charged out at 25 cents in a move to shift behaviour. In Scotland, there's been discussion around this as well. So Scotland has had really interesting discussion where they've talked about the potential to single out the packaging price from a product. Currently, we see one price per product, and it includes both the product and the cost of packaging. But in the Scottish discussions, they've been talking about saying, for example, with a cup, you have to put a 20 to 25p charge on that, and you have to display the price with two components, the product and the packaging. Back home in Australia, we've seen national legislation being discussed that emulates the EU directive. At the same time, individual states and territories and also councils are tackling single-use waste using a variety of measures. So the City of Hobart is one example, and they're probably an Australian first when it comes to passing a bylaw against key disposable items. So theirs focuses on plastic cups, lids, containers, straws, and even condiment sachets, which will be banned from mid next year. The key thing there is that compostable items are still allowed, and we'll talk a bit more about that further down the line. New Zealand is interesting. 6 months after having implemented their national plastic bag ban, Jacinda Ardern came out and said that banning or phasing out single-use plastics was a personal priority for her. So we can see that there really is a move afoot to drive change, and communities are calling for it. So in 2019, pre-COVID, when South Australia issued their proposed legislation for public comment, they had a 6-week period and they garnered more than 3,500 responses from the community, which for South Australia is apparently quite huge when it comes to community consultation. The really interesting thing with their consultation was that 97% of the community responses said that they wanted government intervention to address single-use plastic, 97%. Now, with COVID and a move afoot by some retailers and some cafes to go from reuse back to single-use, you might think that the public perception out there has changed, but a Canadian study that was done in the middle of June actually shows otherwise. It shows that 86% of respondents, when asked whether they wanted the government to proceed with proposed single-use ban, said that they did. And that was up from 81% the previous year. So I guess the question is, why then did we suddenly see some cafes stop accepting reusables when COVID-19 hit? And in some respects, it makes sense. COVID-19 caught many of us by surprise. There was much uncertainty, there was much fear, and a lot of people had no idea what to do. Cafes particularly, they were looking around for guidance for someone to follow. In March, unfortunately, it appears that Starbucks became that guidance when they voluntarily banned single-use cups or reusable cups in store. Now, they were one of the biggest polluters in the industry, and they established a really convenient status quo with that one move. And other businesses looked to that and quickly followed suit. Now, when many cafes did that, interestingly, in our discussions with them, they thought that they were receiving government guidance to do so, and on the whole, that's not been the case. The big plastics industry has been really working hard during this crisis and have really been exploiting fear. In the US in particular, they've been lobbying very strongly to equate single-use with sterile and to work to appeal single-use bans. Unfortunately, they've had some success here. And in the US, this definitely isn't a first. They've had a history of successful lobbying. While there are many municipalities across the US that ban or tax plastic to some degree, lobbying from the plastics industry has also led to a swing the other way, and 17 US states have actually passed legislation saying it's illegal to ban plastic. So effectively a ban on a ban. So I think for all of us, it's really important to understand the why, the things that are going on in the background that we may not be aware of. So let's talk about the science. Is single use more sterile than reuse? And in a word, no. Single use does not equal sterile. So COVID-19 puts us all on alert and we'll all react differently, but it is really important that the decisions and actions we take are evidence-based. And when compared to properly washed reusables, single-use items are a poor substitute. They're not a sterile fix-all. This quote that we've got here is from the Victorian government and was issued in approximately March. At the time, they and others like the Northern Territory stated there is currently no evidence to suggest there's any benefit in switching to disposables. and it's important that the measures we take to minimise transmission are effective. And I think this is really key. The measures we take need to be effective and need to be grounded in science. Now, current Victorian government advice hasn't changed that much. Their advice says there is currently no evidence to suggest any benefit to switching to disposable, single-use food and beverage containers, crockery or cutlery. And we, during this pandemic, have spoken to a lot of health specialists, doctors, scientists, epidemiologists, and those that we've spoken to have all really been taken by surprise at the move back to single use. So one of the key things they all say is that pathogens like viruses and bacteria, they don't distinguish between reusable and single use when attaching to surfaces. Disposable items can collect pathogens when they're sitting atop a coffee machine, during transport, storage, or manufacture. Just like the World Health Organization states that we need to be hand washing, and that's one of the best ways to combat viral spread, the same approach applies to reusables. Clean hands, clean keep cup. It's really the same. And scientists from around the world, including one Vinette Macheri from the University of Texas, says viruses are unlikely to survive a dishwasher. Many have repeated this sentiment as well. And the thing here is that, yes, we can all be putting our reusables in a dishwasher and feeling confident that they will be washed. Also, if we don't have access to a dishwasher or we prefer to hand wash, the science is saying that that's all right too. The same as the World Health Organization states with hand washing. If we have a clean keep cup using soap and hot water, we have a clean keep cup. And that's going to really address any virus particles that were on the cup. So it's clear that reusable systems can be used safely by employing basic hygiene. This is from a statement that was released in June of over 119 scientists in 18 countries who signed a joint statement calling for increased reuse and highlighting that single use is not a safer alternative. They really called for reuse for a couple of reasons. A, because they wanted people to think about the science and recognise that single use does not equal sterile, but they also highlighted that reuse and refill systems are an essential part of addressing the plastic pollution crisis and moving away from a fossil fuel-based economy. One of the key things they also highlighted, which has been brought up again and again when we talk about the circular economy, is that these systems create jobs and help build local economies. And in the current crisis, that's exactly what we need. We do need to be shifting towards a circular economy that builds jobs, not a throwaway society. When we spoke to Dr. Enzo Palombo, he's a food health and safety expert from the Swinburne University, he said also that reuse, he was quite surprised that single use had been taken up so much during the pandemic and that reuse was safe. He had a really interesting point actually, and he said that if there is an issue in a cafe, then probably one of the riskiest areas would be when someone puts a lid on a cup. Now, our guidelines for reuse are for consumers to keep hold of their lid. Whereas if you're using a single-use cup, the barista is putting that lid on themselves. So in some respects, there are situations when reusables could even be safer. Dr. Suzanne Davey, she's from Canberra, a GP and former chair of the ACT, Australian Medical Association. When we spoke to her about this issue, said it makes absolutely no sense to me that cafes have gone back to using disposable cups. There's no scientific basis for it. So we're hearing the same thing from scientists and medical professionals around the world. So what do we recommend? Well, for reusers, there are 4 simple steps. Wash your reusable item in the dishwasher or hand wash with detergent. Number 2, clean hands, clean keep cup. Wash your hands regularly with soap or water, or use a hand sanitizer if there's water not available. Number 3, as usual, only hand over a clean and dry keep cup and keep hold of your lid. Now this guidance, keep hold of your lid, actually hasn't changed. We always advocated for that pre-COVID, but it's something that we're pushing more and more just to make sure the message does get out there. And number 4, if your cafe isn't accepting reusables but is serving in a ceramic cafe cup, then you can always decant your ceramic cafe cup coffee into your Keep cup. The key thing here is that there are cafes that are allowing reusables. We know one in Croydon that is completely free from single use, and throughout the pandemic, although they thought momentarily about going back to single use, they didn't go through with it, and they continued to be a single use free cafe throughout the pandemic. There are cafes around Australia and in New Zealand that are accepting reuse, and we should all be supporting them. So the message here is, as a Keep cup user or a reusable user, let's all get out there and support those local cafes that are accepting reusables. From a cafe perspective, we recommend very similar steps. Number one is obviously to follow the local food safety directives in your area and wash your hands regularly if you're a staff member with soap and water. Number two is to accept only clean and dry Keep cups from customers and refuse any that are visibly dirty. And as a cafe, as a barista or a cafe owner, if you see a visibly dirty reusable, say no. You know, that's well within your right, and that's what we should all be doing. And number three, ask customers to keep hold of their lid. Now, there are cafes that have temporarily changed the way they're serving into reusables, either dosing, also known as a contactless pour, or washing reusables prior to filling. Some have gone down these pathways, but others haven't and are just accepting reusables as per normal. One thing that I do want to touch on is this compostables thing. A lot of cafes have, in the move back to single use, decided to opt for compostables, and they're thinking that they're doing the right thing. I think we need to be really careful about that. Compostables aren't necessarily the answer. We know that compostable materials usually need to be commercially composted. That's compostable packaging materials I'm talking about there. Usually need to be commercially composted, and that these facilities are few and far between. In Australia, only an estimated 18% of councils have or plan to have curbside organics collection, and even fewer of those accept compostable packaging. It's even the case that in the UK, some MPs have seen the issue of compostable packaging ending up in landfill to such an extent that they've actually called for a stop of industrially compostable packaging. So we need to be really clear when we talk about compostable packaging that compostable doesn't mean composted. And much of this packaging does end up in landfill. In addition to that, we've actually conducted third-party life cycle analysis that was peer-reviewed. It's available on our website if you want to have a look. And it compared Keep cups with 2 other reusable cups and 2 single-use cups, one of which was a standard paperboard cup and the other was a compostable cup. And the compostable cup came out worst of all those cups that were analysed. It had higher carbon emissions across its life cycle. So if you are interested, do jump onto our website and have a look at that. But I think it's something we really do need to think about if people switch to compostable materials. COVID-19 has highlighted the link between human and planetary health, and it's definitely been a stumbling block for reuse. But it has, I think, shown us that reuse is critical and how closely the health of our people and our planet are connected. A tidal wave of plastic waste is being touted as an outcome of the pandemic. This was a headline in the LA Times recently, and unfortunately, it is looking like it's true. We are seeing so many disposable items being used and now washing up on our beaches. So we don't have the luxury of focusing on one crisis and then the other. The climate, biodiversity and waste crises, they don't stop for COVID. So we need to be dealing with all of these all at once. The positive thing, if something positive is to come out of this pandemic, is that it has given us pause to think about the world that we want to create and a different reality, and showed that when we listen to the science and come together as communities, then we can really drive change. And I think that's incredibly positive. On that note, I really love this quote by Margaret Mead: "Never doubt that a small group of committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." And I think we all need to think about that in these times where we might see people switching to single use, and there is a lot of confusion, fear, uncertainty out there, but actually we can rally around things like reuse, the move to a circular economy, and our individual actions can drive change beyond the immediacy of the action that we're taking. As Kim said, by others seeing that we're out there taking this action and driving change, we're creating a groundswell of action. So all of the references that I've mentioned today are linked here, keepcup.com/cleankeepcup, if you want to have a look. Otherwise, I look forward to questions after we hear from Amanda.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Fabia. I really appreciate such a fantastic presentation. Lots of food for thought there. One of the comments came through was that, can we get some sound bites on some of the quotes and stats that you've presented there? So yeah, really thank you so much for sharing with us, and we'll have a few questions at the end as well for you. I will pass over to Amanda finally to give us a bit of a case study. I really wanted to wrap up this session with a sort of a good news, positive story around reuse that's happening. And we're definitely looking to New Zealand at the moment to provide a bit of inspiration in this area, because I feel like we're definitely lagging a bit in Australia, unfortunately. So Amanda is the executive assistant with the sustainability team at the Victoria University of Wellington, and she plans, champions and leads a range of sustainability initiatives across the university with a focus on engaging staff and students with sustainable actions. So Amanda's going to be talking through one of their initiatives with us today, and I will pass over to her. Thank you very much, Amanda. Just get you to unmute.
Hi, Ray. Thanks for that. I am just trying to get my screen to share. Can you see that one okay?
Perfect, thank you.
Great. Good day, everybody. My name's Amanda Cunningham. Thanks, Ray, for inviting us here today to share our story about our launch of our returnable cup scheme that we launched last week, or relaunched last week at the beginning of trimester 2, now that we've got students back on campus. So I'll give you a little bit of background. Back in 2018, we decided to launch a reusable cup scheme on campus. And so we looked at 2 or 3 different options. There was a cup cycling program run by a company called Ideal Cup. Globlit was another group of people that bring plastic cups basically onto campus and take them away and wash them and bring them back. And then there was another scheme called Again. We had a student club here on campus, Plastic Diet, and they had an initiative operating at the time called Waste Watchers. And so they loaned out reusable cups to people on campus, and they took them back in and they washed them. They had a little station set up in our hub where they literally hand washed cups and dried them and put them back into circulation. So we met with our super group of representatives from all the sustainability clubs on campus, and to discuss the options to see what they wanted to do. But the students were really clear that they didn't want us bringing on something new. They really wanted us to just carry on working with what was already in play, just to scale it up. But we didn't have a commercial washing facility that we could use for doing that. And so when we approached the retailers to see if they were keen on expanding this, they were, and they all agreed that they would take in the cups and wash them. And so in the meantime, one of the outlets had a small supply of cups that they were loaning out, and they had called them boomerang cups. So we just went with that. So we had a small budget for this. So we went out, the sustainability team purchased secondhand cups. You can get them from dump stores and secondhand stores all around the place. It depends where you go as to how much you need to spend on them. We provided the retailers with the cups and the return bins and the promotional materials, and we promoted the campaign across channels across the university, sorry. So the retailers, it was really simple. The retailers offered the cups to customers, they collected them, washed them, put them back into service. So if you'd taken a cup You didn't have to take it back necessarily to the place that you got it. You could take it back to one of the other participating retailers or in one of the collection bins that we had sort of scattered around the hub. They were really popular, the cups. People really liked to use them and were keen to take them. However, we had a really low return rate. And we kind of went on restocking the retailers and promoting the schemes, and the cups went out and they never came back. But we didn't want to give up on the scheme. We wanted to understand why the cups weren't coming back. So we talked to a group of master's students that were doing an environmental studies paper, Drivers of Human Behaviour, and they undertook a research project looking at the barriers to the success of the scheme, or why people weren't bringing back the returning their cups. So in their research, they identified forgetfulness and laziness as a barrier to people returning the cups, and they focused on forgetfulness because they felt people just needed reminding about the new behaviour in order to change their actions. So they developed a prompt in the form of a sticker to act as a reminder for people to engage in the target behaviour. They used positive non-demanding language, which was "thank you for returning me." Sorry, I haven't. Thank you for returning me. I think I need to show you that one. And so it reminded people of the desired behaviour. Plus, the sticker made the cup identifiable. So there's this last slide here. So over lockdown, I worked with the colleagues from our Office of the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Māori to come up with a new name for our system that staff and students could identify with, and that was sort of unique to our university. So auraki, it means to return, and it means to urge, and it also means mainstream. So it was about normalising the returning. The subtitle, Returnable Cup Scheme, sort of explained what it was, because auraki doesn't actually mean cups, but we felt that just sort of gave it a little explanation. We also decided to make the labels bilingual with whakahokia mai on them, which literally means to make it return to where it came from. We chose "Please Return Me" as a positive image to endorse the act of returning the cups. We just felt that "thank you" kind of indicated that the action had already happened. Our marketing team designed the stickers and the signage for the return bins, and we had a poster campaign, and it's gone out through social media, and we have did screens in the hub that are advertising the scheme. So on campus we have 5 outlets that provide hot beverages, and 4 of the 5 outlets are currently participating in the scheme. And just this morning I had a response from the final outlet saying they are keen to come on board, so that's great news for us. And yesterday I talked to all the outlets that are currently offering auraki cups, and they said that the customers are really keen to use them and they're going out, and the great news is at the moment they're still coming back. So that's our little story about auraki cups. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Amanda. I'm blown away that you just don't seem to have had much way back from COVID with your cup scheme. So I'm really glad to hear that it's going well so far. Again, thank you to all of our presenters. I think we've had a really interesting and broad spectrum sort of collection of ideas and information from our 3 presenters. So thank you again for all sharing with us. We've got a couple of minutes left at the end of the session now to answer any questions that you might have. So for all of our participants listening at the moment, if you have a question for our panelists, now's the time to pop them through. I've got a couple coming through on the chat and the Q&A. Firstly, and I think Fabia, you covered this, a lot of the resources and graphics that you used in your presentation are available on Keep Cup website for people to access, that's correct?
Yeah, if there's anything else you need, feel free to email me. It's fabia@keepcup.com.au, and we can make sure that our marketing team sends it out, or send out the references to you.
And of course, we'll have the video available if you want to rewatch it or share it amongst your colleagues or across any of the networks that you want. Because as I said, getting the message and the information out, getting past that fear and misinformation that's been shared really broadly is so important for us at the moment. So a couple of questions that have come through. Sue has put one through around plastic bottles as being a problem point as well. So any information around seeking alternatives for water and other drinks, which might be an entire discussion in itself. So I'll put that out there for if any of our panelists do have any comment on that. Oh, I knew that was going to happen. Meanwhile, panelists, can you see the question there if I just mute for a second? Maybe you want to talk about plastic.
I'm happy to comment briefly on plastic bottles. So in choosing which items I was going to focus on in my research, I kind of had this conversation with my industry partner, but also just looking at it from a behavioral perspective. And bottles are kind of they have different problems associated with them. There's different drivers and there's different barriers to avoiding bottles. Also from a retailer perspective, bottles can be a bit problematic. So with something like Keep Cup, it's fantastic because cafes can still sell their coffee just in a reusable container. Whereas for someone like Coca-Cola, they can only really sell their product with the packaging attached to it. So in a lot of conversations I've had with policymakers and a lot of reading that I've done in other literature, they tend to focus rather on, instead of focusing on reusable bottles, which I still wholeheartedly support, but the focus shifts more to, well, what do we do with the packaging at the end? Container deposit schemes, let's increase recycling rates, all of this stuff. I'm not necessarily endorsing that that's the right option. As Fabia said, recycling is not necessarily the answer. Composting is not the answer. We really need to be focusing on that kind of avoidance side of things. So I think a lot of the lessons from all the other items would still apply around, you know, how easy is it to avoid the item in question? How much do we see other people doing it? I think reusable bottles have definitely become more popular in the last 10 or 20 years than they were earlier than that. But they do have just a few other kind of barriers that come up, particularly in this circular economy. That would be a fantastic one to really target for bottles.
Great. I'm so sorry I had to duck out there. I had a fear that was going to happen, and it did. Sorry. Another question that's come up is around with a lot of campuses at the moment, for example, not having students on them. I realise New Zealand's well ahead of us in returning to campus at the moment, but in Australia there are a lot of us that it's not going to be happening this year potentially. How do we get retailers to stay on board with the reuse scheme? Like if we've got any key sort of, if you're going to try for one thing to engage with your retailers, what would it be? This is a broad question for anybody that wants to take it.
I guess my question would be, if there are cafes that are still open and serving those that are on campus or those that walk through campus, I think it's the same way we engage with all our cafes. And that's highlighting that reuse can safely continue, making sure that we cut through the pseudoscience and the idea that single use is equated with sterile, and share the knowledge and have open conversations. I think that's the best way to really share this information and make sure people do continue to reuse. Another thing is to highlight that reuse is allowed. I think that's a real point of misinformation out there, where cafes look next door and see next door diverting to single use and think, oh, well, we must have been told to do so. So being really clear about that and saying, hey, reuse is safe and this is how to do it.
Thank you for that. I'll move on to the next. We've got a few questions. I'm not sure that we'll get through all the questions that have been typed in the live session, but I will let everyone know if you've typed a question through, particularly addressing a panelist, I'll forward that onto them and we may be able to answer after the session today if you sent something through specifically. One of the comments came through was around implementing container deposit schemes. So New Zealand is considering doing this. So Rachel's asked if anything like this similar is happening in Australia. I'm aware that this is a very state-based thing. So there are container deposit schemes in some states. I'm pretty sure New South Wales has one. South Australia's had one since the dawn of time, as far as I'm aware. Victoria very much behind the curb on this, although I've heard whispering it's coming. Yeah, Kim, you're saying it's coming. So yes, it's slow, but definitely starting to happen here. Another question, again, Rachel, you've put one through. Markets, there are only markets for recycling type 1, 2 and 5 plastic. Do you think it likely with lobbying that something else can be phased out? Or something else, can we phase out types 3, 6 and 7? So phasing out types of plastics is the general question there. I'm getting the sense, particularly from the information that Fabia provided, that there's a very strong lobbying group behind plastics and big plastic, and I don't have anything particular to comment on in that question. Do any of our panelists have any insights there?
I think the only comment I would make there is, yes, there are some plastics that are harder to recycle than others, and as much as it'd be good to kind of hone in on those to get people to avoiding them, at the end of the day, recycling is just not the answer. You know, I've seen life cycle analyses where they've kind of looked at the recycling process, and yes, in fact, in some cases, I think recycled items actually, you know, use more energy or use more water than stuff that's come from virgin material. So if you look at the entire impact, at the end of the day, I'm just going to keep banging on about the waste hierarchy, which is step number 1 is avoidance. We want to avoid as much as we can, we want to reuse as much as we can, and only once those have been exhausted, then we start look at recycling options, disposal options. So I would probably say, rather than trying to hone in on the specific types of material that people are using, that we really focus more on the underlying circular economy. I'm going to keep reusing these terms as well. We want to focus on circular economy, we want to focus on reuse, and we want to focus on avoidance.
Definitely. We've been running a lot of sessions over Plastic Free July, and the waste hierarchy is our go-to always. Refuse, reduce, reuse. Definitely. So it's a good answer to return to. So thanks for bringing that one up. Karen's asked about, Kim, if you're aware of any similar studies to your research done in other states like Queensland. So I'm not sure if you've got any other.
Not specifically. So part of my research was really starting with the plastic bag ban, because Victoria hadn't yet implemented it. So they wanted to get a sense of kind of what was going on, how much did people support it. They had done a community consultation, which was also done in Queensland, WA, everywhere that's now introduced plastic bag bans have done community consultation. And an earlier part of my research was using social media or seeing what was being discussed in social media to get a bit of a gauge of what people are supportive of or what people are doing at the moment. And if you look at social media comments in aggregate and compare them to news reports, you actually get a sense that people are far more supportive of action and are actually engaging in a lot of these behaviours more than we might think that they are, especially if you look at news, which tends to focus on undesirable behaviours. They focus in on the adverse reactions to the ban. So I know when the supermarkets banned plastic bags, there was reports of someone in WA choking a staff member with a reusable bag or something horrendous. Happened once, but it was reported over a bunch of different news stories, which made it seem really common. But if you look at the social media comments, the reaction was, oh my God, this is terrible. And in fact, a lot of people in those states that didn't yet have bans were referring to states that did to talk about the fact that we need this. And in fact, we need more. One of the most common things that I've been seeing in the social media stuff that I've been looking at is that not only are people supportive of legislation and of avoidance of plastic, but they want more. They're kind of hungry for more. The government should be doing more. They should be helping us and making it easier for us to avoid. I think I rambled. I don't think I answered your question, but it's some new insights.
Yeah, I mean, there were plenty of examples of that. I know Target, when they first implemented the ban on bags, they had 500 complaints, and that was enough for them to reintroduce bags, or those, the ones that they considered reusable bags, with 500 complaints, well out of proportion with the people that welcomed the change. So yeah, unfortunately, it's a really common story. We're out of time for the session today, so I will actually wrap up because I appreciate people have got meetings and things to rush off with. If you didn't get your answered question in the chat, we will follow up after the live session. I thank all of our presenters again for joining us today. I hope everybody stays safe and well. I know that I'm competing with a live announcement from the Victorian Premier at the moment on COVID stuff. So if you stayed with us through that, I really thank you. And that's it. We'll wrap up now, and I wish you all an amazing rest of the day, and good luck with your Plastic-Free July and single-use plastic avoidance efforts. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Ree.